You ever have a conversation with yourself that shifts something deep inside you? The kind where your own voice feels like both a question and an answer. That's what happened when I started thinking about what it means to truly see faith, especially when it shows up in ways the world doesn't always expect. When I speak to myself in the quiet moments, in the hush of morning light, or the stillness that follows the chaos of the day, I'm reminded that the most important conversation I will ever have is the one I have with myself. Because that voice, that whisper within, it shapes everything. It determines not just how I see myself, but how I view the people around me. That inner dialogue becomes the lens through which I witness the world, and it can either blur the truth or bring it into sharp, compassionate focus. When I speak to myself with judgment, I become guarded. When I speak to myself with fear, I view others as threats. But when I speak with openness, when I speak with the kind of love I so freely offer others, I begin to see humanity in its fullest, most expansive expression. And that is where transformation begins. Too often we speak to ourselves from a place of scarcity. We tell ourselves we don't know enough, we haven't done enough, or we don't understand enough to truly engage with others whose experiences differ from ours. Especially when it comes to faith, especially a faith that has been so heavily politicized, stereotyped, and misunderstood in the West, we retreat. We say, that's not my world, or I can't relate to that. But that is the exact moment when our self-talk becomes a wall instead of a window. The surge of Islam across Western societies is not a foreign invasion. It is not something to be feared or resisted. It is a human story unfolding right beside us. And when I listen to how I speak to myself about what I do not understand about the unfamiliar, I realize that the fear isn't about others. The fear is that I don't have the language, the heart, or the courage to stretch myself into a new level of empathy. But the truth is, we do. We all do. We were born with that capacity. The woman wearing a hijab on the subway, the father praying quietly before his meal in a crowded cafe, the child navigating 2 languages and 2 cultures in a Western classroom. These aren't strangers. These are reflections of the same human longing I carry. And when I allow myself to speak inwardly with reverence instead of resistance, I see that I don't have to get it all to honor it. It starts with the words I say when no one is listening. Am I open? Am I curious? Can I release the need to be right in order to simply be present? These questions, these gentle invitations, shift something within. They soften the armor that years of social programming, fear-based narratives, and cultural divisions have built around us. And that softening, that is power. That is where real awareness lives. Speaking to myself with compassion means making room for complexity. It means knowing that someone else's truth, someone else's faith, someone else's God doesn't diminish mine. It doesn't threaten me. In fact, it expands me. It reminds me that the world is not a monologue. It is a chorus, and every voice matters. When I start talking to myself with the belief that I am capable of deep understanding, I become a better listener, a better neighbor, a better co-creator of a world where faith is not a battleground, but a meeting place. There is immense power in that kind of self-talk, because it isn't just about affirmations or feel-good mantras. It's about preparing the heart for connection. It's about recognizing that before I can reach out, I must first look in. And what I find there, the thoughts, the assumptions, the inherited biases, I must hold with tenderness and truth. That is the real inner work. That is where transformation happens. Not on the outside, not in the headlines or the debates or the statistics, but in the mirror, in the quiet, in the moment I choose to speak to myself not with fear, but with faith in my own ability to grow, to stretch, to love beyond the limits I once thought were fixed. Faith as a bridge, not a barrier. There is something deeply human about faith. At its core, it is a reaching toward meaning, toward belonging, towards something greater than ourselves. And yet, in so many places, the word faith has been used to divide instead of unite. It's become shorthand for difference, for conflict, for suspicion. But when I take a step back, when I listen not to the noise but to the people, the mothers, the sons, the elders, the seekers, I hear something far more powerful. I hear that faith, especially in the hearts of those living between cultures, between worlds, is not a wall, it's a bridge. In Western societies, the rise of Islam is often spoken about in numbers, in statistics, in trends, but those numbers are lives. They are souls carrying prayer mats in their backpacks. They are hands over hearts in early morning devotion. They are the quiet resilience of a woman who chooses to cover her hair in a world that stares at her like she is both invisible and too visible all at once. And when we reduce their experience to demographics, we miss the deeper truth. This isn't just about population shifts, it's about spiritual identity being reclaimed, expressed and honored in places that once told these very people they had to choose faith or acceptance, tradition or belonging. But what if we didn't force that choice? What if we saw faith not as a fork in the road, but as a pathway that can weave through every kind of society, every kind of story? When I meet someone who lives by the rhythms of their prayer, who breaks their fast with joy and shares that joy with others, I'm reminded of how much we all crave a sense of sacred rhythm in our lives. We all want to believe that there is purpose in our pain, that there is a divine order even when everything feels chaotic. And for millions of Muslims in the West, Islam offers that grounding, not in opposition to Western values, but alongside them, not as a rejection of freedom, but as an expression of it. We have to understand, faith, when rooted in love and community, doesn't isolate. It connects. It draws people into families, into neighborhoods, into service. And yet so many times Western narratives frame Islam as incompatible with modern life. But who defines modern? Who decides what kind of faith fits into what kind of future? Because when I look at the stories unfolding around me, I see a generation rising that is blending heritage and hope. I see young Muslim women starting businesses, writing poetry, building non-profits, raising children with strength and softness. I see young men finding healing in their traditions, not shame. I see elders finding peace in mosques nestled between coffee shops and train stations. That is not division. That is integration. That is expansion. And when I talk to myself about these realities, when I speak inwardly with honesty, I ask myself, am I building bridges, or am I maintaining barriers that no longer serve me or the world I want to live in? Because if I hold space for the truth that faith can be both personal and public, both ancient and evolving, then I can also hold space for the reality that Islam is not arriving in the West. It has been here. It is growing not because it is foreign, but because it is human. Because it is speaking to something that lives in all of us, the desire to be seen, to be safe, to be spiritually grounded. There is so much power in allowing ourselves to see faith differently, to stop treating it like something that keeps us apart, and to start recognizing it as the thing that has always had the potential to bring us together. Because faith in its purest form doesn't say you must become me. It says I see you. It invites, it welcomes, it offers the sacred gift of presence. And when that presence is honored, not just tolerated but truly welcomed, it creates a space where something remarkable can happen. Listening to the unheard voices, there are stories that never make it to the evening news. There are voices that speak in whispers, in languages we do not understand, through traditions we have not taken the time to learn. And yet these voices carry the weight of whole worlds built on faith, family, resilience, and quiet beauty. In Western societies, where noise is often mistaken for importance, the surge of Islam is not just happening in the streets or on the news or in policy debates. It is happening in kitchens filled with the scent of cumin and cardamom, in living rooms where verses from the Quran are recited by heart, in classrooms where children are learning to be both rooted and adaptable, in mosques that hum with generations of prayer. It is happening in places that go unseen by the mainstream, unheard by the majority, but are bursting with life and depth and meaning. Listening to these unheard voices means pausing the narratives we have been taught and asking a deeper question: who gets to tell the story? Because for far too long the story of Islam in the West has been told about Muslims, not by them. It has been filtered through fear, shaped by suspicion, and framed in language that strips away the humanity and sacredness of a faith that touches over 1 billion lives around the world. And when I listen to how that feels, when I put myself in the shoes of someone whose spiritual identity is constantly questioned or misunderstood, I begin to feel the deep ache of invisibility. But invisibility is not the same as silence. These communities are not silent. They are singing lullabies to their children. They are having long, loving conversations about belonging, about dignity, about how to carry centuries of tradition into a world that often tells them to let it go. They are navigating complexity with grace. They are creating, building, healing. And if we take the time to truly listen, not just with our ears but with our hearts, we begin to hear something that can change us. We hear that faith for many Muslims in Western societies is not a reaction to the world but a relationship with the divine that has been nurtured through every season of life. It is not just about ritual, it is about rhythm, a rhythm of surrender, of compassion, of striving towards something higher, while staying deeply grounded in everyday love. And that rhythm speaks even when the world isn't watching. It speaks in the young woman who quietly prays during her lunch break at a corporate job. It speaks in the elder who teaches his grandchildren how to perform ablution with care and reverence. It speaks in the artist who weaves Arabic calligraphy into her paintings, not for validation but for expression. It speaks in the student who learns to recite ancient scripture with perfect breath and cadence, holding on to each word as an act of devotion. These are the voices that deserve to be heard, not just to correct a narrative, but to expand it, to enrich it, to remind us that spirituality does not come in one form, one language, or one expression. It is diverse, it is personal, and it is everywhere. When I listen to these voices, I also begin to listen to myself differently. I begin to ask, what assumptions have I inherited? What stories have I absorbed without question? What spaces of my own heart have gone unexplored because I was too afraid to encounter the unfamiliar? And in asking those questions, I create room not just for others, but for myself. Room to grow, room to heal, room to understand that empathy begins not with agreement, but with presence. Presence is what these unheard voices are asking for. Not pity, not performance, just presence. To be seen, to be acknowledged, to be allowed to speak in the fullness of who they are, without needing to explain or apologize. Because when a faith lives in the margins for too long, it becomes easy to forget that it was never meant to stay there. It was meant to flourish, to contribute, to teach, to inspire. And it already is, whether we are paying attention or not. Living between worlds, rooted in spirit, there is a quiet, steady strength in the experience of those who live between worlds. For so many Muslims in Western societies, life is a constant act of balance, of honoring the past while navigating the present, of carrying the memory of a homeland while trying to build a future in a land that may never fully feel like home. But within that balancing act is something extraordinary, a deep and unshakable spiritual grounding that offers direction even when the world feels uncertain. Living between worlds is not just a matter of geography or language. It's a daily negotiation of identity, of choosing how much to hold on to and how much to let go. It's walking into a boardroom after attending Fajr prayer at dawn. It's adjusting your child's lunchbox to meet school guidelines without compromising your values. It's the decision to wear your faith on your sleeve, sometimes literally, knowing that doing so might bring stares, assumptions, even danger, but also pride and peace. And through all of this, faith becomes more than belief. It becomes home. It becomes the place you return to again and again, even when the world does not recognize where you've come from. There is something profoundly moving about the way spiritual identity endures in the face of displacement. For many Muslims in the West, the mosque becomes more than a place of worship. It becomes a cultural center, a community hub, a sanctuary from the noise outside. Friday prayer is not just a ritual, it's a gathering of people trying to stay tethered to something sacred. Eid celebrations are more than religious observances. They are declarations of existence in spaces that sometimes render them invisible. And in private moments at the sink, in the car, in the quiet before bed, there is dhikr, remembrance, a whisper of God's name that becomes a lifeline between two worlds. For those who have immigrated, who have fled war or poverty, or instability, or who have simply sought opportunity and safety, the act of holding on to faith becomes an act of resistance, of resilience. It says, I will not be erased, I will not be diluted, I can be both here and whole. I can raise my children with stories from my grandparents' village and still dream of their place at the highest levels of society. I can speak English with fluency and still pray in Arabic with fluency of the heart, and I don't need to choose between them. Both can live in me. For second-generation Muslims, the story takes on another shape, one that is often even more complex. They are the children of two cultures, two languages, two sets of expectations. They are asked to fit into societies that often don't understand the layers they carry. They are asked to explain themselves before they even fully understand who they are. But many of them find clarity, not by rejecting one side, but by building a new one where faith is not a relic of the past, but a guidepost for the future, one where they rewrite what it means to be Western, what it means to be Muslim, what it means to belong. In this space between worlds, the spiritual self becomes both anchor and compass. It roots and it guides. It keeps the heart steady when the headlines feel heavy, when the politics feel harsh, when the systems feel stacked against you, and it reminds people that no matter where they are on the map, they are held by something greater, that their worth is not determined by how well they assimilate, but by the integrity with which they live. So much of this inner strength is invisible to the world around them. It doesn't show up in polls or news segments, but it shows up in the way they raise their children to be both proud and compassionate. It shows up in the food passed around a crowded dinner table, in the prayers said softly before sleep, in the poetry written in the margins of notebooks, in the confidence to say, "This is who I am," without shrinking. The external world may demand performance, but the inner world is where truth lives. A call to radical empathy. There are moments in life when we are invited, not forced, not coerced, but invited, to widen the lens through which we see the world. Moments that ask us to step outside the narrowness of our own experience, and into the expansive, often uncomfortable beauty of someone else's truth. Radical empathy begins there. It begins in the willingness to feel with, not just for, someone. It is not about agreeing with everything, or fully understanding everything, but about choosing to stay present even when the story is not ours. When I speak to myself with honesty, I have to admit that empathy does not come automatically. It takes practice, it takes humility, and it takes the courage to admit that the way I see things, my culture, my upbringing, my traditions, is not the center of the universe. That realization is not a threat, it's an awakening, because the more I root myself in that truth, the more I see that the people around me, those whose names I mispronounce, whose holidays I don't know, whose clothes or customs I might not recognize, are not strangers. They are storytellers, wisdom holders, bridge builders. They are living full, complex lives, filled with pain and joy, fear and love, much like mine. Radical empathy means being willing to see Muslims in the West, not as a symbol or a headline, but as neighbors, co-workers, classmates, friends. It means allowing the full humanity of their faith to exist in our consciousness, without requiring them to perform for it. It means resisting the impulse to flatten their identities into stereotypes, whether those are of victimhood or threat, and instead honoring the multifaceted truth of their lived experience. To be Muslim in the West is to often live under scrutiny, to be questioned before being welcomed, to have to explain the most personal parts of oneself to strangers. That weight, carried silently and daily, is a burden most of us will never understand, but we can choose to witness it. We can choose to soften around it, and to do that, we must first soften how we speak to ourselves, because how we talk to ourselves shapes how we talk about others. If my inner voice is filled with judgment, I will judge others. If my inner voice is defensive, I will meet others with resistance. But if my inner voice is curious, open, tender, then I create space within myself to let someone else in, without needing to change them. I can allow someone's difference to sit beside my own without fear that it will erase me. That is radical empathy. It's not passive or performative. It is active, rooted in accountability, and willing to be changed by the encounter. When I think of radical empathy, I think of the small gestures that rarely get attention, but speak volumes. The teacher who learns how to pronounce her students' names correctly, because she knows identity begins there. The neighbor who brings over food during Ramadan, without needing an invitation. The manager who creates space for prayer breaks without being asked. These are not grand political statements. They are quiet, personal choices to honor someone else's humanity. It is in these choices that the fabric of society is rewoven, because systems change when people change, and people change when they are seen, heard, and valued. But no one can be seen if we keep turning our gaze away from discomfort. Radical empathy requires us to stay in the room, to keep listening even when it gets hard, to hold space without rushing to fix or judge. It asks us to look beyond language, beyond dress, beyond doctrine, and into the heart of what makes us all human, a longing to be accepted, protected, understood, and loved. Faith in this context is not a barrier but a bridge, and empathy is the path across. Not a gentle surface-level empathy, but one that sits with pain, that wrestles with its own biases, that stretches the spirit. One that says, I may never know what it's like to walk in your shoes, but I will not turn away from the path you're on. I will walk beside you, not because it is convenient, but because it is right, because that is what it means to be human, in the deepest sense. That is what it means to choose love over fear, presence over prejudice, truth over silence. When I speak to myself this way, with honesty, with reverence, with the courage to see what's really unfolding around me, I begin to understand that what we're witnessing in Western societies is not just a demographic shift or a political talking point. It's a spiritual reawakening, a surge not of foreignness, but of faith, a deepening presence of Islam that invites us all to examine how we live, how we connect, and how we honor the divine in one another. It's easy to build walls when we are afraid, when we don't understand, when we feel threatened by what is different. But the truth is, the rise of Islam in the West is not a threat, it's an opportunity to grow, to listen, to build something more whole than what existed before. This is not about Muslims needing to prove their worth or fit into a mold. It's about recognizing that worth was already there, that wisdom, beauty, strength, and grace were always part of their story, whether we were listening or not. And now we're being called to listen, not with suspicion, not with caution, but with open eyes and softened hearts. We're being called to look at a woman in a hijab and see power, to hear the call to prayer and feel reverence, to read the Quran and discover shared values of mercy, justice, and love. We're being asked to stretch our compassion until it becomes unshakable, until it becomes the way we live, not just what we say. Because at the end of the day, this isn't just about religion, it's about what kind of world we're building. It's about the stories we tell, the spaces we share, the dignity we uphold. Faith in a new land doesn't mean losing something, it means expanding something, and that expansion, that brave, necessary, human expansion, can only happen if we're willing to meet each other where we are, as we are. That is the path forward. That is the conversation we need. That is the faith we're being called to. Faith in one another. Faith in our shared future. Faith in the beauty that rises when we dare to listen, when we choose to see, and when we speak to ourselves and each other with love.